Greetings and welcome to our virtual celebration of Easter on the Farm 2021 at the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center at Kutztown University. As a way to virtually celebrate the arrival of spring, we've prepared 6 hours of cultural programming today highlighting the customs, traditions, music, and arts of the region. My name is Patrick Donmoyer and I'll be your host for this online event as well as the first presenter for today's programming. To kick off our event, I'd like to introduce the folk customs, observations, and rituals in the culture's annual celebration of spring. These traditions are rooted in both sacred and secular practices and form the colorful backdrop for the region's cultural expression as Rites of Spring, Eastertide and Vernal traditions among the Pennsylvania Dutch. Many of the traditions that we have come to recognize today as distinctly Pennsylvania Dutch seasonal celebrations are deeply rooted within the liturgical calendar. The time leading up until the season of Easter is die Fastnacht in Pennsylvania Dutch. This is the liturgical season of Lent. This is technically a movable season, and it contains movable feast days as well, because it begins 40 days before Easter. Now, Easter moves each year, although many holidays such as Christmas and other times like that are fixed on the calendar and never change their date. Easter is one of those celebrations that changes every year. And it's based upon the first Sunday after the first full moon following the vernal equinox. So Easter is always in spring because it is that first Sunday following the first full moon of spring. But it begins 40 days prior to that for the season of Lent. And the season of Lent is always kicked off on Ash Wednesday, the day after Shrove Tuesday. This presentation today will start with Shrove Tuesday, just to talk about that entire Lenten season, which is all about recognizing the end of winter and moving into spring and all of the symbolism that comes along with that. The religious symbolism, even the secular symbolism, relates to this passage of the awakening of the earth. So whether we're talking about the religious traditions or whether we're talking about many of the common customs that are not necessarily directly related to Christian practices today, we'll recognize that there are some commonalities to both of these. Now, typically on Fastnacht or Shrove Tuesday, this is the time just prior to Lent when folks would essentially be taking stock of what they have in their pantry. They would be using up all of the sugar and fats that are in the house in order to make sure that they are prepared for a time of fasting. Fastnacht literally means a time of fasting, the evening of fasting. And usually in German, when you see an observation ending with the word Nacht, it is because it is the evening before another day. So Fastnacht is actually the day before the fast begins. So typically this would be a time when folks would get their potatoes, they would make mashed potatoes in order to make a potato dough that they would then allow to rise overnight. They would cut this dough into small squares or other shapes, sometimes diamonds, sometimes simple lumps, and these would then be fried the next day in large quantities. Today, we refer to these as Fastnachts, but in the past, this was a Fastnachtkuchen. And so the idea was that this was a little cake that was being fried for the occasion. Now, the belief associated with this is not only the idea of leading up to a fast, but it also relates to other folk practices. Now, you'll see a spatula in this picture because you're going to use a spatula many times in order to get these off of the pan after they've been rising. You're going to use tongs or something else to get them out of the oil. But the fact is, I've also got a sickle on here. And this is due to the fact that people would use that oil from the process of frying their Fastnachts, and they would use it to anoint the tools that they were going to be using throughout the year, especially those that were going to be used for breaking ground in the garden. And the interesting thing about this is that that same fat would be saved until later in the season for the harvest. And so you would be later anointing all of the sickles and scythes and even the grain forks and even the axles of the wagons that were going to be used to bring in the grain. You'd have a lot of fat left over because folks believed that the more Fastnacht cakes you made, the more likely it was for you to be able to build positive, strong relations within your community because you'd be giving them out. And a season of abundance would occur. They believe this would have a direct effect on the quality of crops, such as flax. The flax would be a staple for previous portions of Pennsylvania Dutch history when flax was used for making linen in the home. The quality of your flax was believed to be directly determined by how many Fastnachts you were making and in what proportion your generosity was for giving these to your neighbors. The grease from Fastnacht can almost be compared to a holy unction because it was not only used for greasing tools, but it was especially used for healing as well. Folks would apply it to old sores, any part of your body that was sore that didn't seem to be healing very quickly, sores on your hands from working, things like that. It was believed to also be able to relieve fevers and used in a wide variety of recipes where folks would infuse this grease into salves that could be made later on in the season with herbs. And we'll talk about the gathering of herbs later on. But the great thing about this time is that you can use this fat that's directly related to this night before or day before the start of the Lenten season in order to be able to take stock of your tools. In the process of anointing your dung forks, your grain forks, your shovels, your scythes, anything you're going to be using in the garden, your spades, your rakes, the fact was you were also taking stock of these tools. You were doing it collectively with possibly your family or your neighbors, and you were going to notice if any of these tools were requiring repair. And this is such an important thing because we often forget that these processes, these folk rituals, were not just done solo. These were done as collective expressions of community identity. Now, the very next day, of course, on Ash Wednesday, this was another really important day. This was actually the start of Lent, and many people went to church on this day. Not only did you receive ashes when you were in church, typically the minister would make a cross on your forehead with ashes that had been mixed with oil, and this would be applied directly to the forehead with the phrase, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." However, among the Pennsylvania Dutch, the belief was that it wasn't just humans who needed ashes. They would take the ashes and they would sprinkle them around the perimeter of the house. They would sprinkle them over their cattle and around the perimeter of the garden. The belief was that this would drive out pests, parasites, and illness and protect the house from illness, calamity, fire, things like that. And so we see on this slide, "Strij die esche vom esche mitvok. Es hausrum über die Vieh, wens vom Gorde." This is the fact that you're going to be spreading these ashes, especially over the cattle, was a common one. Now, they also used to play a prank. And this was the idea that if you woke up late on Ash Wednesday, you would get tumbled in the ashes, and they would refer to you as the Esche Poodle. This is also similar to a practice that would happen the day before. The last person to wake up on the day of Fastnacht, you would be referred to as the Fastnacht for the day. And this was a polite way of teasing a member of the household who would be the last person to wake up. Now, there's also ramifications to that. If you're the last person to wake up, it means you don't get first dibs on those Fastnachts as well that are going to be fried first thing in the morning. Now, immediately following Esche Mittwoch, now this, of course, is going to change every year. You're going to find that there is this period of austerity. You're going to find folks are eating less. This is time for folks to be taking stock of what they have and trying to get it to essentially last the rest of the winter. This technically starts as far back as Groundhog Day, when people would say, "Licht mes spinverges, halve stro and halve fress." It means on Lichtmas, you are supposed to forget your spinning. If you haven't done it already, spinning flax, spinning wool, you should put it aside. Because if you haven't finished it yet, there's going to be a lot of work to come in the preparation for spring. They would say you needed half of your feed and half of your straw as well in order to get through the year for your animals. Now, by the time of Ash Wednesday, you're really starting to think about what you have left on the farm. And this is such an important thing because it's going to be some time until the day when you can actually get some things in the ground in your garden to prepare for the growing season. Now, typically the day to kick this off is St. Gertrude's Day on March 17th. March 17th is also St. Patrick's Day, but in the old agricultural calendars, typically among the Pennsylvania Dutch, it was St. Gertrude who was venerated on this day. This is St. Gertrude of Nivelle. St. Gertrude was the patron saint of gardeners and also the patron saint of cats and of the ridding of rats and mice and vermin from the farm. So this is a fascinating thing. Folks would take crumbs and they would walk the perimeter of the garden and sprinkle these crumbs in order to drive out vermin from the garden. But there was also a very special prayer that went along with this that was recorded by a relative of John Joseph Stout by the name of Amanda Bear Stout. And on St. Gertrude's Day, she recalled that she would say, Epis grina, epis schwarze, epis weiße for ihre Katze, Bachtma Dach am Trudistag, Streidi Grim Lavutsi Mag, vom Eck zu Eck, am Gorderand, so Vaxa die Greide or vom Land. This particular prayer was recently published by Dr. William Woys Weaver in his book entitled Dutch Treats, Heirloom Recipes for Farmhouse Gardens. And he also provides a recipe for how to use this particular prayer. The prayer means something green, something black, something white for her cat. Bake Dutch on St. Gertrude's Day, scatter the crumbs where she directs from corner to corner along the garden's edge so that your plants will thrive upon the land. This particular prayer makes use of colors, talks about green and black and white. Now, what goes into this Dutch that is baked, this special Lenten cake? It is a cake that is very thick. It doesn't rise much. It is a cake that's going to be baked directly on the hearth. And what you would put in this to correspond to the colors are the white of the salt and of the flour, but also black of the rye. And you would also be putting on some form of green that might at that point in time be popping up, especially any form of spring onions, which are some of the first things that you can find even throughout the winter time, many times to have as something green. And so this was the Dutch that's baked on the hearth, and you would sprinkle these crumbs around the perimeter of the garden on St. Gertrude's Day in order to usher in the spring. Now, the next major collection of these types of rituals and customs that were done in the home for the Easter season are those pertaining to Holy Week. Now, Holy Week technically starts on Palm Sunday and extends through Easter Vigil on Holy Saturday. Now, typically what you're going to find is that these traditions very much overlap with the festivities of the week taking place in church. And I guess I should call them perhaps not festivities, but observations, because this is a very somber time of year. And the customs that go along with it are somewhat somber. Now, Palm Sunday, according to the biblical narratives, this would have been the time that Christ arrived in Jerusalem riding a donkey, and people greeted him with palm branches. This was a joyous celebration to start the week. And of course, that somber mood only increases as time goes on. But the traditional way of observing Palm Sunday is that folks would bring palms or other types of grasses into the church, and they would be used as part of the liturgy. They would be held by the congregants, and many times people would make Palm Sunday crosses. Now, of course, you're supposed to be listening to the sermon on Sunday, but I even remember this when I was a kid, that you would take those palms and you would make them into palm crosses. Folks would then take those palm crosses and put them in their home. They would stick it above their mirror. They would put it above a picture that might be hanging in their living room or parlor. You would put it above the doorway. Folks would sometimes put these in their cars or trucks as well. The belief was that they offered some protection to the home and protection to the bearer. And these were referred to as Palmsondag Razer, because these were really the crosses that were going to be made on Palm Sunday. And of course, many different traditions use these as well. You're going to find this in the Eastern Orthodox Church, Catholic Church as well, and they take on different significance based on the types of patterns that are made. I've seen elaborate roses that are made by members of the Eastern Orthodox faith, and so you're going to find a wide variety of the ways that palms were used. But this act of weaving them together was part of this seasonal observation. You were taking something that was thought to be consecrated because it was used in the liturgy in church, and you're taking it home with you. This act of consecration is not just taking place in church, but also due to the fact that folks believe that this was an auspicious time of year. And this especially is true for Green Thursday, Grüne Donnerstag. And this was a time when you were going to be going out to cut the Bispetblätter, or the dandelion greens. Green Thursday is so called because of the fact that historically this was referred to as Grüne Donnerstag. And Grüne had to do with the word groaning or agonizing. This was the day before Good Friday, and it was the day on which Christ was arrested according to the biblical narratives. So originally that word grüne wasn't green, it was to groan. But the word grüne and also the word greene in Pennsylvania Dutch is the word for green. So you can see how these traditions seem to imply this idea of something green. And that is what undergirds the eating of greens on Green Thursday. People would use these greens in the home, make salads with them. They would make hot bacon dressing that would go over top of them. Now, I want to point out that these greens in this image are pretty mature. You have to be pretty static, as we might say in Pennsylvania Dutch, to appreciate how strong these greens are. Typically, you go for the small, littlest greens with the actual top of the root ball that you would then cut the root off, but you would keep that top of the sprout of the young leaves, and they were the most tender. That was the most traditional thing to do. But the belief is that these were going to be a purifier of your blood and your digestive system. And people believed that they were going to keep you from becoming lousy and foul. And so this idea of laziness is the Pennsylvania Dutch word for foul. It would keep you from having kind of the spring lethargy that can happen when you're just not prepared for that growing season to start. This is also believed to take root. This practice of eating these bitter greens is believed to take root from biblical narratives associated with Christ observing the Jewish Passover. Now, the Seder, as people would practice it today, is more recent than the time of Christ. It was a development specific to the Jewish community, and I don't want to speak in any way, shape, or form for the Jewish community and their customs and their holidays, especially the ways that Christians have borrowed those holidays and customs over the years, haven't always necessarily been in cooperation with the Jews. So it's a really important thing to remember, to be conscious of that and to be sensitive to that over the course of the year. But many Christians will trace this particular act of eating the greens to Christ partaking of a Passover supper according to the biblical narratives, because we have to remember that Christ was Jewish. So many of these traditions that you're going to find are not just related to European Christian practices, but also coming from practices that would have been common to Jews in the Middle East. Now, the next big day in Holy Week is Good Friday. This is the day that marks the crucifixion of Christ, according to the biblical narratives. But one of the things that folks would do is they would gather the eggs that were laid by the chickens on the farm on Good Friday. They would eat those eggs in an omelet. They were believed to be good for you in order to rid you of any form of illness. It would prevent fevers and things like that throughout the year. And people would also save some of these eggs for healing practices. You could lay it on the forehead of a person who is suffering from a fever to remove that fever. People also would take these eggs and they would hide one in the home. You would hide it in the attic under a crock or somewhere within the home in a drawer, because the belief was that it was going to keep the house from having an outbreak of any form of illness and save the house from being struck by lightning. Now, this old tradition is one that comes from the time of medieval Europe, when essentially there was a development within the Roman Catholic tradition in the liturgy for the blessing of eggs. Well, up until the early modern era, folks would actually take eggs to church to be blessed. Those eggs would then be consumed in the home. They were thought to be consecrated. They were thought to have special properties, but they were also distributed to the poor. And the interesting thing about these Karfreitags Eier, or Good Friday eggs, is that they are part of a longstanding tradition within Roman Catholicism for the consecration of many different types of substances. Salt that would then later on be used sometimes to bless the home or in cooking at different times of the year. Eggs on Good Friday, chalk that would be blessed on the Feast of Epiphany for applying it to your doorway. You would write out an elaborate blessing on the Feast of Epiphany. So this is rooted in Roman Catholic tradition. However, what you'd find is that these eggs were also given out to the poor. And for those people who were receiving something that had been consecrated, it was up to the folks who were receiving it, whether they were actually going to consume it or whether they were going to keep it essentially as a talisman in the home, as a blessing of the home. And this is where many of these traditions come from. But you'll also find that these particular eggs as well Among the Pennsylvania Dutch, they were not consecrated in church. Instead, these eggs were consecrated simply by virtue of having been laid on Good Friday. The interesting thing about this is that this can be rooted not only in Roman Catholicism and the traditions you'd find in the home, but also the way that Protestants later on would carry on these same traditions and emphasize those aspects of the holy times of the year as being responsible for the blessing. Among Protestants, it didn't matter so much whether or not a clergy member would bless something. It mattered more that these were rooted in the sacred calendar, and by virtue of having been laid on a holy day, they were thought to be holy. Now, this aspect of hiding these eggs in a secret location within the home to bless the home is an old tradition. In fact, some folks in Europe even used to take one, and they would take one of these eggs and bury it underneath the threshold of the home, in the very front of the home, or they would build it into a wall in the house, conceal it in the home, or they might take it and put it into a crock or a drawer, as I previously mentioned, in the attic or sometimes in the basement, but especially the attic, because the attic was not only where it was closest to the roof of the house, it was believed to protect from lightning, but the attic is also a place you're going to be storing lots of different types of perishable goods, like apple butter, or sometimes also the herbs that you're going to gather on Ascension Day. So this is an important thing as well. There's always a sense of foreshadowing that takes place within the liturgical calendar. It's not just what's happening on the day of, but it's what's happening as well throughout that season and in the coming season. Another thing that would happen on Good Friday is that folks would collect rainwater. They would take that rainwater and it could be used to cure illness, but it could also be used to baptize children. And many folks used to do this as an annual observation. In fact, there's old folklore that says that it rains a little bit every single Good Friday. Whether it rains a lot is up to debate, but folks would believe that even the gathering of the dew was considered to be sacred because of the sacredness of the time of year on Good Friday. And this is an important thing to remember, the way in which the sacred calendar affects how people operate in day-to-day life. Now, the following day is Holy Saturday, Kar Samstag. We don't have a lot relating to this in Pennsylvania Dutch tradition, except that there would be an Easter vigil late at night. Some people would have a bonfire. There are many different types of things that would happen on a Holy Saturday. But according to old Roman Catholic and Protestant tradition, there was this belief that this was the time that Christ, after his crucifixion and death, descended into the underworld, into hell, to free all of the patriarchs and all of the people who had come before, all of humanity. This was a time when Christ was believed to have released them all from the underworld. Due to this fact that there was this release taking place, the essentially victory over the bonds of hell, you'll find that this was a time of year that folks believed that you could pick up special objects off the ground without any concern that those objects might do you harm. There's a backstory to this. People used to say, "Du musst net etwas auf de Straße aufheben, es ist vielleicht gebraucht damit." And this is an old statement in Pennsylvania Dutch that means you shouldn't pick things up off the street. Someone may have been using it in a healing ritual. And by virtue of that process, it may be carrying some form of an illness. It used to be common for people to rub a penny on a wart or a rag on a wart and drop it in the streets. And if you pick it up, you might get that person's wart. So you left things lay. But on Holy Saturday, you could pick something up, especially horseshoes. A horseshoe that was found, you couldn't be looking for it. You just happened to find it. If you found it and you picked it up and it had nails in it, especially 3 or more nails, this was considered to be a very special thing, and you would hang it on your doorway. Now, typically the Pennsylvania Dutch would hang it with the tines or prongs of the horseshoe downward, because the belief was it was going to bind anything that was negative, keep it out of the house, and protect the home. It is more among the English and those of the British Isles who would turn the prongs upwards, because the belief was that it was protective in the sense of having a blessing that would be contained within. And that blessing, of course, would be within the shape of the horseshoe as a vessel, like a chalice. And the belief was if you hung it the other way, all the luck would spill out. But that doesn't apply to the German traditions, because the belief was the prongs were to go down. This is also common among Italians and a number of other Southern European groups as well, where the horseshoe would be facing downward with the prongs. Now, Holy Saturday is also a really important day because On many of these days, you weren't supposed to work. You weren't supposed to work on Maundy Thursday, on Green Thursday, because of the fact that this was considered a holy day. The only thing you could do was gather the greens. On Good Friday, the only thing you could really do was milk the cows if you needed to, because of course the cows need to get milked. So there's those things that are essential on the farm, and then there's those things that are extra. Anything extra was not to be done. But on Holy Saturday, the one thing you could do in addition was dye eggs, because you needed to do it sometime. And this was a day there was less of a prohibition against working. And you would do the dyeing of your eggs and the decoration of your eggs on this day. And there's a lot of different techniques people would use. Some people would scratch their eggs. They would dye them in natural dyes. Red would, for instance, be created by the use of green. Red would be created by use of onions. Yellow onions actually produce a brilliant red dye. The red onions actually, if it oxidizes with the vinegar that is needed as a mordant for all of these natural dyes, they would oxidize and would actually turn the eggs green. The other thing that makes green dye as well is red cabbage, because once it oxidizes, it starts to turn green. Anybody who's ever eaten red cabbage with vinegar, if you notice on your plate when you're done with dinner, you'll start to see that the juice from that cabbage turns from magenta to a green color. And this is what makes those eggs green. It works if you let that dye sit out overnight and then you boil your eggs in it. Now, some people will blow out their eggs, but it's complicated to get those eggs to sink in the dyes. So you need to almost weigh them down with the onion skins or the cabbage leaves in order to get them to stay in the dye bath. Now, people could make black using a wide variety of things too. You'd use walnut hulls and things like that, black walnuts. You could use, for instance, things like saffron, which was precious, but you could also use other types of wild plants, even turmeric, which you might have in your garden as well, to make a yellow dye. So there's many different types of things you could do. Even blueberries, which aren't available at this time of year, but folks would take them and dry them and powder them, and then you could make a blue dye with them. You could do the same thing with pokeberries for your magenta dye. So if you're ever interested in finding recipes for these natural dyes, you can find them in many different places available online and other places like that to get your natural dyes. Then you can scratch those eggs using like an X-Acto knife or a pen knife, a pocket knife, something like that, to make very fine lines. Some folks would also use a needle or a stylus, but there's a lot of different ways to do this. You can also paint those eggs as well, and that's another common tradition within this area. The scratched eggs in particular are the most distinctly Pennsylvania Dutch. You're going to find that the scratched eggs are also found in Lithuanian culture and a wide variety of other European cultures, but this was one of those things that was very distinctly Pennsylvania Dutch. There are actually eggs that have survived from the time of the American Revolution, from the 1770s. There's one in the collection at Ursinus College, the Pennsylvania Folklife Society collection. And it's a fascinating thing to see the way in which these types of eggs get handed down as heirlooms. People would date them. They would put a name on them. Sometimes people would also dye and scratch the eggs that were used on Good Friday as a protection for the home. It was very common for folks to write on that egg. They would write. Sometimes I've even seen people write Good Friday egg on it so that it was remembered what it was, and so someone wouldn't throw it away accidentally. But many times they would put the year and 3 crosses or something along those lines as well. Now, it's important to remember with these decorated eggs that people were making, they were not just for show. Many of these were going to be eaten. So it's not surprising that many of these did not survive to the present day. Folks would do things that they would call egg picking. And this is where you would go from house to house. Kids in the neighborhood would take an egg and they would knock it against somebody else's eggs. They would do either the tips of the eggs, which were called die picca, and they were the points of the eggs, or you would use the butts of the eggs, referred to as die hinne. And you would bump either the butts or the picks together. And when you would bump them, the person whose egg broke, that egg would be given to the other person to be eaten. And folks would get especially eggs that had the hardest shells in order to be able to compete with these. And then, of course, you would eat them. Now, this reinforces the Easter proverb. And they would say that it's not spring until all the Easter eggs have been eaten. This is due to the fact that not only were people doing this egg picking process, But people were eating these eggs in the home by the scores. There are actually newspaper accounts indicating that people were eating 40 or 60 eggs. It's a fascinating thing to see these accounts that are what we would consider gluttony by today's standards, but really it reinforces that idea that spring won't truly come until all the Easter eggs have been eaten. Sis nog net friår bis all the Osteroja gesses in. This act of egg picking was even documented in Abraham Razer Horn's Pennsylvania German Manual. He was the principal of Keystone State Normal School. And the interesting thing about Abraham Razer Horn, he spoke Pennsylvania Dutch as his first language, learned English from a boy on the farm. His little textbook has all kinds of phrases in Pennsylvania Dutch. It was meant to be able to teach people to read and write Pennsylvania Dutch as a way to increase their literacy and also lend toward the learning of English. This was a progressive idea for the time period because of the fact that it was one of the first forms of bilingual education that was advocated by a Pennsylvania educator. And he says in his book about egg picking, oja picka, uf ostra gept osta oja, no picketsi als menana. Da vum onratsai oi verbrecht krikt oi. Ma frogt als van ma eppa dreft. Wo hush du my osta oia? No mus ma als en oi geva van ma ans hut. And literally this is describing on Easter, there are Easter eggs and people would knock the eggs together. And whoever broke the other person's egg received their eggs. And they would also ask, when they would run into someone, on the street, do you have an Easter egg for me? And then that person would have to give them an Easter egg. These are old customs that were common relating to this process. Now, there are many different types of egg decorating customs, even into the present day. One person who used to do this prolifically and give these eggs out as gifts, just as Abraham Razer Horn had indicated, was Peter Fritz. Peter Fritz was a renowned folk artist. He was a poet, a musician. He's well known in Berks County for many aspects of how he preserved the culture through things like New Year's wishing and his artwork and poems. We have a collection of decorated eggs by Peter Fritz that he gave to the Heritage Center just shortly before he passed away in 2015. And these eggs are what he said were the rejects. And this is such a funny thing to us because he gave so many of these to his family and friends. And he had offered all of these eggs to different folks over the years. And these were the ones that people didn't take. And so he gave us his rejects. And we are so proud to have them because as far as we're concerned, these are priceless heirlooms. Now, one egg that he did in particular that was so important was his depiction of the Osterhaus. And this is an image taken from one of America's oldest images of the Easter rabbit, produced by Johann Conrad Gilbert. He was a schoolmaster and church warden at the Red Church in Brunswick Township, Schuylkill County. But at that point in time, it was technically called Berks County. So we can still call this a Berks County tradition if we really want to, but I don't think that would be precisely fair to all the people in Schuylkill County, especially those still in Brunswick Township. The interesting thing about this particular image is that Johann Conrad Gilbert made the two earliest known images of the Easter rabbit in North America. And these were given out as gifts to his students in the one-room schoolhouse as what they would have referred to as a reward of merit, an award of merit. And this was typically what you would give to a student who was doing the best in school. It was an incentive to get kids to study. Now, this image was reinterpreted by Peter Fritz, but he documents on this egg where this image comes from. And these two images that were produced circa 1810 by Conrad Gilbert are in institutional collections today at Williamsburg and Winterthur. We're lucky enough, though, at the Heritage Center to have a house blessing that was produced by Conrad Gilbert. It is ein schöner christlicher Haussegen für alle fromme Hausväter und Hausmütter. A beautiful Christian house blessing for all pious house fathers and mothers. It was produced on February the 3rd, 1784, signed by Conrad Gilbert himself, and it was made for Mr. and Mrs. Adam Schmidt of Tulpehocken Township, Berks County. And it says, Zum Segen jedermann, die es hören und lesen. And this is for the blessing of anyone who hears it or reads it. So this was implying that this was meant to be spoken aloud at different times of the year, especially on special days, perhaps on Easter, but then also on other days throughout the year, such as Christmas or other holy days. And there are many different auspicious days of the spring that we don't often think about as following Easter. These days often overlap with liturgical days, but some of them are just folk cultural days. And this is an interesting thing as well. We have these auspicious days of spring. Many of them are rooted in the old farmer's almanac. Erstmoy, May Day, comes shortly after Easter, about a month after Easter, depending on where Easter falls within the calendar. Himmelfahrt, which is Ascension Day, which is basically the 40th day of Easter, 39 days after Easter. And you'll find too that this year, Ascension Day is on May 13th, but then there's Pentecost, and Pentecost is typically 50 days after Easter, the 50th day, technically 49 days later. And this year it is on May 23rd. Pentecost is always on a Sunday, and Himmelfahrt is always on a Thursday. Now, the interesting thing about the Erstmoy is that it's technically the feast of Walpurga, who is a saint. In Old Europe, Walpurga's Nacht is the night before, but typically on the morning of the 1st of May, folks would go out and they would gather the dew, just like they would gather rainwater on Good Friday or gather the dew on Christmas. That was another tradition. They would gather the dew on the 1st of May because it was believed to be able to remove warts, freckles, and blemishes. So you would put it on your body, you would anoint yourself with it. And there are all kinds of stories going along with this for how this was done. Now, some versions of the ritual claim you have to go outside and you can't be wearing any clothing and that you have to be naked. And there are lots of funny stories about this of people who were spotted going outside naked on the 1st of May before the sun rose to gather the dew, and the people getting surprised by their early morning farm neighbors who happened to be out milking the cows or something else and catching sight of their neighbor who would rush back inside because they'd be embarrassed of having been caught doing this old Pennsylvania Dutch ritual. Now, the interesting thing about this as well is that according to the old calendar, the 1st of May was technically the beginning of the light half of the year. This is really when visibly you start seeing a major shift in the time of the year. And this is such an important thing because the days really are truly longer on the 1st of May. Obviously, this starts as early as, the coming of spring and the equinox. Of course, this also, technically starts on the solstice, that the days start to get longer. But really, the changes really become the most visible following the time of the 1st of May. And this is opposite in the calendar from the time of Allerheilige or Allerlevenstzeel, which is the time of All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, which is technically at the end of October, beginning of November. So the 1st of May and Walpurgisnacht is opposite that in the calendar. And this springtime day was marked in Europe many times by people going out on May Eve, the feast of St. Walpurga, and they would hold bonfires. The belief was that historically, folks believed that this was the night that when witches would go out and dance on the top of a famous mountain in the Harz mountain range known as the Brocken, and people would claim there were these eerie lights that were seen. Now, people would also burn bonfires on that night in order to drive the cold winter away and to really embrace spring, to drive the dark half of the year away, and to embrace this aspect of the coming of spring. Now remember, May, you can still get frost as early as the beginning of May. So this was truly about making sure that the last hurrahs of the dark half of the year were truly over. And you'll find, for instance, old images in the agricultural almanacs talking about the folklore associated with Walpurgisnacht. But you'll also find this really, truly still is a European tradition where folks talk about claiming to see lights on the Brocken, which is the highest mountain in the Harz mountain range in northern Germany. Another May tradition you typically end up finding that there is hail sometime in early spring, and people would gather the first hailstones of the year. The belief was that these first hailstones, if consumed, would keep you from getting a fever throughout the year. Now, we had our first hail, as far as I was concerned, 2 nights ago here in Pennsylvania. Now, we had our first hailstorm on the day before St. Gertrude's Day in Pennsylvania this year. At least in Montgomery and Berks County, we had some hail. I went out and got the first 3 hailstones I saw, and I ate them because the belief is that it'll keep you healthy throughout the year. And we all know we need to stay healthy right now with all that's going on in the world. Now, these were referred to as Hagelschlose. These were hailstones, Hagel being the word for hail. Now, the interesting thing about this is that you're going to find that these hailstones at one point in time were thought to be a symbol of divine judgment, because hailstones could really wreck your garden if they come late season. So it's preferred that they come before the holy season, before the growing season, because of the fact that you don't want those hailstones to wreck your garden once you have seedlings coming up. And this was such an important thing. But this actually dates back to a time, at one point in time, people would use words for the weather among the Pennsylvania Dutch to indicate they were used as curse words. So people would say donavera nokomo, which literally means thunderstorm once again. And some people would add on to that, heilig hagelschlosa donavera nokomo. And you would find that these were all invocations of bad weather, because these were thought to be curse words. And they relate back especially to ancient veneration of the weather gods. For instance, especially Dona is not only the word for thunder, but also the word for the god Donar, who was an ancient god responsible specifically for lightning and thunder, otherwise known as Thor among the Scandinavians and Dona among the Old Germans. This is basically the same concept as what you'll find for Jove among the Greco-Roman tradition, or Zeus. And this is something that's ancient, so you can see how it's still part of our language today, how people will say, Heilig Hagelstan Donavera Nokomo in Pennsylvania Dutch, that's one of the worst curses of all you could possibly say. And you'd hit it when you hit your you would say it when you hit your thumb with a hammer, or trip over a rake in the garden. You'd say Donavera. Himmelfahrt is Ascension Day. And again, Ascension Day is 39 days after Easter. It's technically the 40th day of the Easter season. We have to remember, among the liturgical calendar, you're going to find that Easter is not just a day, but an entire season that follows. And all the things I've shared with you thus far are technically part of the Easter season. So this is 10 days before Pentecost, and it's typically on a Thursday, 40 days after Easter. And this is, according to the biblical narratives, this is when Christ had made a series of appearances and then finally ascended up into heaven. Now, due to this fact, you're going to find many early traditions associated with this act of ascension. You'll find early images of Christ ascending, and a lot of these early images show footprints of Christ that were left behind. Some people believe that those footprints could have been measured, and the footprint of Christ, or even the footprint of Mary, was thought to be special in Roman Catholic tradition. Now, we have some of this left over in Pennsylvania in the publication of a little book that was referred to as Geistlicher Schildwacht, or literally the spiritual vigil. And you'll see little images of the saints, and these were published in Reading as well as in Erie, Pennsylvania. They were primarily published for folk cultural purposes. Folks would use the prayers within to bless their home and other things like that. But the most popular Ascension Day traditions pertain instead to the fact that you were not to work. You were supposed to avoid work in all forms, especially anything that involved sewing or binding. So if you sew on Ascension Day, the belief was that you get struck by lightning. There are stories, for instance, and these may be, technically apocryphal, but there are stories about bad storms that would occur on Ascension Day while the people were in church, and the minister would say, somebody in the congregation has sown on this day. Woe to you who have sown. If you have a garment that you have sown before church today, I want you to take it off and put it outside. And there's a story about a woman in Berks County who took off an apron that she had sewed that morning, put it on the fence of the church outside, and it got struck by lightning. So these types of old stories and beliefs are things that were very, very common, but you weren't supposed to hammer a nail or do anything else This was also depicted by folk artist Gladys Lutz. You can see a person through the window in this painting being struck by lightning because she's sowing on Ascension Day. Now, Gladys Lutz was called the Grandma Moses of the Lehigh Valley because of her preeminence as a folk artist. The one thing you could do on Ascension Day, of course, was to pick medicinal herbs. Herbs like sassafras or sassafras, Schlongewurz, which is snake root, Sayorblader, which is broadleaf plantain, Kaelkraut, which is jewelweed, and Gundelrebe, which is your ground ivy. All of these things were thought to be medicinal in a wide variety of ways. Gundelrebe, or ground ivy, was especially used to cure cows that were going dry. The belief was that if these cows were dry and it wasn't due to old age, that it was due to illness, the belief was that they had been bewitched. And so you would take ground ivy, make a wreath of ground ivy, and then you would milk the cow through the wreath and then toss the wreath up into the air, and it would cure the cow. But there's many different traditions. People would eat many different types of greens on this day that they would gather. They would hang the herbs that they'd gather in the attic underneath the eaves of the house. And many times people would make a tea of 7 or 9 herbs. They would especially use catnip, vervain, plantain, chicory, cinquefoil, snake root, and stinging nettle. For many people, it didn't matter to them which herbs were used, which is really a surprising thing. But the belief was, as long as there were 7 herbs in it, this tea would prevent illness throughout the year. Now, for some, it really mattered which herbs were being used. For others, not so much. For all these folk cultural traditions, you're going to find that there's a lot of variation. The one thing you could also do on Ascension Day is go fishing. Now, this probably relates to the fact that on Ascension Day, there was this biblical narrative associated with what they call the Great Commission, according to Christianity. And this was when folks were asked to go out and baptize people of all nations. And Peter, James, and John, these were the first disciples who were called by Christ according to the biblical narratives, and they were fishermen. And they said that, oh, we can't follow you because we have to go fishing. And Christ said, I will make you fishers of men, and a foreshadowing of this great commission to go out and to proselytize. So the idea was that fishing on this day was something that was acceptable on Ascension Day. Now, the other thing that folks would do as well historically, and we don't like to talk about this too much, is that many times people would actually go out and kill birds of prey. This is just such an awful thing, but the belief was that these birds of prey were these sinister animals that were going to go and prey upon your chickens and other livestock. This was once commonplace in Pennsylvania, and this wasn't just common among Pennsylvania Dutch people, but Scotch-Irish, English, many different portions of the Pennsylvania community would do this. And this is an awful thing because it left behind a legacy of near extinction for some of these animals. And so people would kill hawks and eagles, all kinds of things. And then they would hang the birds on their barns because the belief was it would keep those birds of prey away from the barnyard. This is just an awful thing. But thankfully, due to efforts through organizations such as the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, they've raised awareness of why these animals really need to be not only legally protected, but protected in just everyday life. So this is a kind of a sore spot on our local history, this Ascension Day tradition. The other thing people would do is they would sweep out the house on Ascension Day, and they would take those sweepings from the home and they would deposit them on somebody else's property, because the belief was that it would get rid of all the nasty stuff from your home, and in so doing, it would deposit on somebody else's property. Now, a lot of these traditions, whether it's the prohibition on sowing or whatever else, it's due to the fact that there's this belief that the time of the year is related to this biblical narrative of Christ rising and ascending to the clouds. Things would be uprooted, things would be pulled away, things were meant to be unfastened, unloosened. And so what you're going to find is that these traditions often relate directly to this aspect of loosening things, just like the sweepings of the house were thought to unleash, anything that was in the house, any illness or any misfortune, and you'd be depositing that on somebody else's property. Now, Pentecost is an interesting tradition following 10 days after Ascension Day. This was the day, according to biblical narratives, when the Holy Spirit was brought to the early church fathers and mothers, and the Spirit appeared on the foreheads of the individuals as tongues of flame. So there are many different things that are associated with this particular day, but typically this was a day in church among Protestant Pennsylvania Dutch people that you would be confirmed. And this is such an interesting aspect of the tradition, because this was a time period when local people would oftentimes get their one and only set of new clothes. Confirmation was considered one of the most important things for young people in Protestant communities, and this is one of the things that would typically done. Now, there is an old proverb as well that deals with this idea of Pentecost, or Pinkster in Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, this particular proverb says, "Du hast Pinkster voor Ooster." You're celebrating Pentecost before Easter. And people would say that when you would catch the hem of a person's garment and you would see a petticoat or underwear accidentally when a person would bend over too far. And this has to do with the fact that typically people would get new petticoats as a gift for confirmation, that they would then wear, of course, underneath their confirmation outfit. You wouldn't see them, but this was one of the few times you would get some new clothes. And so people would say, if you see someone prior to Easter time, and you would see the hem of their petticoat or their underwear accidentally, if they bent over and their pants were a little bit low, they'd say, "Du hast Pinkster voor Ooster." You're celebrating Pentecost before Easter. Now, the other thing that you would find typically is that there are flowers associated with Pentecost, and they refer to as Pinkstblume. Now, there's two different Pinkstblume. Some people refer to lilac as Pinkstblume. And the interesting thing about this is that there is no real ritual or customary use of the lilac, except that you would plant lilacs around the outhouses. If you ever go to old farms in the area and you see lilacs planted different places, it's probably because that's where the old outhouse used to stand. Now, interestingly enough, you will find, though, for Europeans and for some Pennsylvanians, the Pinkstblume was not the lilac, but the peony. The peony itself was thought to be a healing plant used in healing traditions. It was thought to prevent fevers. You could take water in which peony blossoms were used, and you would take those blossoms and infuse them in a tea or a water that was not consumed, but applied to a person who had a fever in order to reduce the fever. It would also prevent infant convulsions, according to early folklore as well. So this was very much an important thing, because this is a flower that is red. Pentecost is associated with fire, as indicated in the previous images I showed of the biblical narratives, and it was thought to cure fever. So the real Pinkstblume is peony. However, in Pennsylvania, you'll find that that term was also applied to lilacs as well. And this is such an interesting aspect of the local season. This presentation is being offered the day before Palm Sunday, so Holy Week technically starts next week. And even if you're not religious, you can still partake in some of these types of traditions because they're celebratory. They're part of a regional experience. Going out and getting greens out of your front yard. These are things you can do regardless of what background you are and what religious persuasion you may be. Scratching eggs is something you can do to celebrate the spring and appreciate the regional experience of the Pennsylvania Dutch. And these are things that we hope many of you will consider taking at least a closer look at when you hear about them in your local community. There's a lot we can learn from these things, and it's such an important aspect of our local traditions. Thanks for watching, but don't go away. Coming up next, explore the traditional techniques of Pennsylvania Dutch scratched and Binzegras eggs with Elaine Vargin of Holy. Cultural programming for this virtual celebration of Easter on the Farm 2021 is brought to you by the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center at Kutztown University, the hub of Pennsylvania German culture and language. Visit us online at www.kutztown.edu/pgchc. Thank you to all of our viewers, supporters, and friends. Mir zahle groß Dank zu alle unser Gucker, Unterstützer und Freund. Macht's gut.